There is always something tempting about the Jeremiad. After all, the genre of pointing out the foibles and flaws, of criticizing the powerful and the weak and the social norms, has a long tradition, one of the longest we have in known recorded literature, as soon as we find epics and religious laws, we find Jeremiads, whether they are in the prophets of the Hebrew Old Testament or in the complaints about social norms esoterically riddled throughout Plato's dialogues and writings. There have always been Jeremiads. And thus, there have always been predictions of the apocalyptic, the collapsarian. The reality is that collapse and apocalypse rarely are an event, and that even once a society has changed its modalities, completely moved to something else, a revolution happened that changed social relations, the exact moment or even precise sequence of events becomes unclear, even as the hour of Minerva flies. No. We have to deal with clearer things, clearer incentives. And the Jeremiad will not help you here. In fact, there is almost something inherently reactive about the Jeremiac mode, responding to social norms purely as criticism, without some positive guidepost. The flaws in the apple are obvious, but what an apple that is healthy looks like is not. We have to think about this in clearer ways. I've worked in left-wing media in some capacity now for about 13 years. I've worked in media in some capacity as a side gig for about 22 years, maybe a little longer. And by that, I mean I have gotten some kind of compensation for something I've done, be it music reviews, interviews of bands, interviews with philosophers, lectures made public, long conversations. Interviewing is my favorite form of engaging with ideas. While I realize that writing in our culture has a legitimacy and a lengthiness that it often doesn't deserve anymore, as most of my writing is no longer even available. It's lost to the internet memory hole. And for some of it, I'm actually quite happy that it is. For others, not so much. But I have worked in this now between blogging, working on magazines, working for a publisher, reading book manuscripts, making podcasts, and doing YouTube videos and Twitch streams for over a decade, since well before Occupy Wall Street really began, and well after now, as we approach its 10-year anniversary. I have mentioned this paraphrase before. I can't remember the exact quotation, and it is attributed to Pat Buchanan, which is political movements mature into businesses and rot into grifts. This seems like to imply that all the political pundits and whatnot are grifters. And in some sense, my critique is, no, they're not consciously. They're not trying to deceive you. But also, in some sense, they are offering a product on a media market. It should be treated as such. And if you confuse it for politics, for political action, or even a coherent political worldview, that is usually a mistake. But there's another element to this that I think needs to be really addressed. I was recently talking to Charlie Roberts about an article he was writing. And I'm not going to talk about the contents of the article because he has not yet released it as of when I'm recording this. And it is not my way to leak the writing ideas of friends. But his article, needless to say, that he has been writing and rewriting and trying to get into a modality of fairness as he writes it, because it's easy to snipe at the particular ludicrousnesses of left-wing political media, or of any political media. All political media in time sounds ridiculous. It either sounds narcissistically obsessed with small differences or small details, often many of which become irrelevant within months or years of release. I know this if you listen to, for example, the early episodes of a show I did called Pop the Left, not the one that you know with Doug Lane from 2019 to 2021, but the one that Doug Lane and I and a few other people did from 2011 up through 2015, of which there may be 12 episodes made in the course of several years. The reasons for that are complicated, some of which has to do with my internal fights with Douglas Lane. If you go back and listen to those, particularly the first four, they seem totally irrelevant to now, or particularly about movements that do not have the same political sway that they once did. There are discussions about Chomsky and anarchism, Zizek, Bob Black, John Sayers, and anarcho-primitivism, post-left anarchism, which is a completely different animal than today's post-left Marxism, whatever that is. Most of these ideas ended up being ephemeral. And when I worked on two magazines, I worked directly with the North Star. In fact, I was part of a team that Pham Bing, the former editor who had launched the site under the direction of Louis Project, the late Louis Project. Pham had noticed some of my blogging and knew of me through a political society that I had left recently, at that time in 2013, even though I was in South Korea, and wanted me to write more about world politics and then come on as an editor. And a lot of what I did for that site was interviews, and I commissioned articles, the most famous of which were commissioned by Paul Shetler and I. It's a series of articles, starting with Mark Fisher's The Vampire Castle, which is the infamous one, but also articles by Jody Dean, Michael Rettenwald, Sam Criss, etc., responding to it. Up-and-coming luminaries in either left media, left academia, many of whom have disappeared because they've been canceled or changed politics. In the case of Rettenwald, it's become conservative. In fact, I believe he was one of the last guests on Bill O'Reilly's show on Fox News. Wouldn't be the first time that's happened either. When I was recently arguing with someone on Facebook who said, I don't know anybody who's gone from being a social democrat to a right-winger, and then I listed off 20 names of people that I just personally knew. Whereas people who've gone the other direction tend to be myself and Matthew Stillman and maybe one or two other people who are Republicans. I kept on thinking about this because in many ways, my career, in so much that I've had one, and the career of the places that I work for, have been built off the memory and eventually literally the corpses of other thinkers. While the North Star was built actually not on the back of Mark Fisher, but on the legacy of Peter Cormejo, whose attempt at left unity and whose role in the formation of the Green Party was an inspiration to Louis Project. Quickly after the Vampire Castle essay was released and the flurry of responses happened, the North Star went away, the other articles are largely lost, and yet two different publishers, and in some ways even a magazine, have made a lot of use of his memory. And by that I mean Zero Books, where I worked, Repeater Books, which was the house kind of founded by Mark Fisher and co. when they left Zero. Tariq Goddard and some other individuals who were involved. Immediately began battling over Fisher's legacy, where I was the most critical because I did not know Fisher well. My interactions with him before commissioning the article were mostly through my friend Paul and through a series of letters where we went back and forth and argued about the definitions of class on K-Punk. And yet, for many years, many careers were lost off of Mark Fisher. Many people responded and moved in and out of the left based around that singular article. An article whose immediate context, which was the defense of Russell Brand, defense of Jeremy Corbyn, now seems so anodyne and so far in the past that it's that the memory of the article actually fails to mention what it was primarily about. When Jacobin magazine ran several odes to Fisher later, they of course mentioned this, and we actually found it republished. I don't know with permission or not, and I don't know who would have had the permission, as rights were not worked out at the North Star, as they weren't in many semi-informal left publications. Regardless, Fisher's ideas had a life beyond their own, but mostly popularized, unfortunately, or repopularized in the United States by his early death. Similarly, with Michael Brooks. Michael's producers have created a plethora of shows around the Majority Report and moving out of the progressive sphere. Brooks created many left celebrities, including celebrities of friends of mine, personal friends. And yet, this industry that's grown up around it has not really known where to go or what to do, or had an immediate political project beyond some tactical regional things around the DSA to orient itself. This is not entirely their fault. In some ways, this is a legacy of Michael Brooks, as Michael himself was developing a politics that was internationalist and yet friendly to those who were not sectarian leftists, and was broad enough for different tendencies to interact. And yet his charisma often, frankly, papered over the differences between people. And in his absence, many oppositions developed almost instantaneously between people in his orbit. Some of the most famous of which were people now associated with the post-left who were insulting Michael when his grave was still fresh, after he had defended them priorly. Michael wanted to create a cadre of leftist thinkers. That was his goal, and to get people who often were politically quite different and quite opposed to get into dialogue with each other about a practical, if reformist, politics. That orientation was something lacking in the left outside of the DSA for a long time. It was even when the DSA became a clearinghouse of the many sectarian tendencies of the American left. Those sectarian tendencies did not go away, and they did not always work with each other in tandem. Instead, they competed for power within the National Coordinating Committee, and often, or the National Political Committee, and often did so with informal caucuses, which with sectarian orientations, filling in for regional structures in the organization. In a sense, the entire left that we knew, being born out of the failure of occupying the United States, in the US, was also born as a media project launched by several men, some of whom were not even Americans, and some of whom were not in the US. This has produced a slew of businesses and people who literally have to make money off of continued content, and there are only so many ways to do it. Now, the things that have developed around Michael is nowhere near the worst tendencies of the sectarian left in America, as we've seen the rise and fall of many hyper-sectarian groups that began largely as media ventures, particularly amongst streamers and tweet makers. Tendencies whose organic reach was very hard to even ascertain, as they were being ran by streamers. And as a need for the audience became more apparent and a need to counter pivot against other forms of leftism to become a differentiated voice in an overglodded field, tendencies to incorporate reaction became more and more prominent in these groups. MAGA communism, patriotic socialism, etc. The resurgence of explicitly anti-left-wing thinkers amongst left-wing intellectuals became common, not even because these people were ideologically committed reactionaries, but because they needed a new voice, a new synthesis, a new way to attract an audience. And the more you say something, the more you engage with it, the more likely you are to believe it, as most people have a sunk cost fallacy. While I always tell people, don't be afraid of reading conservative works, don't be afraid of understanding conservative works, there is a sense in which that's all you're doing, and you're trying to use this opportunistically to create a new image to cut through the other voices that are saying the same thing as a way to brand yourself. You will eventually believe what you say. Few people stay that cynical. It is very hard for people to do. And thus counter incentives amongst left media emerge. What start off as mere attempts to point out the hypocrisies or limitations in people's often popular front strategy-driven relationships with the Democrats, where they defend Democratic policies somewhat unthinkingly, even if they do not agree with them. And this has been a problem in a lot of the left as I've seen it grow up. There's also been a counter tendency to respond to that by utter rejection. Not utter rejection off of a principled stance, but in a way to differentiate yourself from the Democrats, which often needs to be done. Do not get me wrong. But if your primary purpose is just to do it for the sake of having a different voice, you can be led astray in many different directions. The rot is at the core. You need eyes, you need an audience, you need money. And the way to get it is to make yourself distinct. And the way to make yourself distinct is often not just to be contrarian, although that helps, but to be contrarian in particular ways. And if you do this well enough for long enough, you can even get fairly affluent backers, both on the left and the right, depending on how you binge where you're aiming your arrows verbally. And when there's not a larger movement to occur, a lot of what we have to do is look at this as a kind of pathological development, a set of path dependencies, of limited choices, of bound choices. As you choose one, you inherently have to choose another thing and another and another. And you no longer are able to set the terms of your own politics by your own thinking and your own views of who your political subject is and what they might want. This is dangerous. It's always been dangerous and always will be dangerous. This is the danger in the parasocial relationship too. There's nothing wrong with parasocial relationships at all. Most relationships have parasocial elements. And I even mean that with relationships in your real life. There are parasocial elements with any element you have where you don't have an equitable relationship with the other end of the party. And there's no way to go through life without many of those things, and not all of them are bad. Someone can have meant a lot to you and you not meant much to them, and that can be healthy. The issue becomes when these parasocial relations become what decides what you think, because you do not know what the parasocial actor's actual motivations are, and they may not know themselves. This is how large groups of people get caught up in weird political movements that seem to have very little relevance outside society and exist only on the internet. And yet people also tend to believe that that doesn't have any effect on people's actual politics, which I can tell you from 15 years of experience online and dealing with political organizing and working with unions and whatnot is not true. Just like conspiracy theories can actually have an effect on people's politics, so can these other kinds of relations and path dependency. This is why I ask you, what is the political orientation of political media for? Mine is purely educational, all right? Because this is not a good medium for other kinds of politics. It's not useful for organizing a workplace, even though I can give you some videos that maybe you can use to help for parts of it. You still have to do the organization yourself. And it's going to be very dependent on the regional, local, and particular needs and even personalities of the people you deal with. There is no shortcut for that. There is no way to make it parsimoniously simple. To give you a few easy tricks, while we make fun of that at national level politics, we should also make fun of that at local level organizing. It doesn't work. You need orientations to help you figure out how to thrive in your context, and then to build organizations that can bridge the gaps between regions and contexts, which is sorely lacking on the left today. Ostensibly, the DSA is the closest thing to this function, but its focus seems to be either hyper-local or hyper-national in relation to the Democratic Party, with the exception of a couple of regional power bases, mostly in New York, actually, where the DSA actually does have a political function, but also seems to function more like what you would expect traditional caucuses to do. This is to say that right now, a lot of the left is suffering from not defeat and not victory, but the limbo that has happened in lieu of being the clear opposition to another form of politics, aka Trumpist conservatism, or whatever that is, right populism, whatever you want to call it. And in many ways, just like the politics of the 90s was defined by movement conservatism, even in liberal enclaves that were fighting against it, our politics have been defined by this and not ourselves. And thus, no wonder everything seems to degenerate into a grift, because there is little for us to offer or build ourselves. I highly doubt, however, you will find that most of the good faith actors on the left are actually happy with this situation. I've had many come to me recently and ask me, how can we start developing think tanks to do political programs? How can we look at the structures of prior political programs and see what the results are historically and not just go off of dogmatic norms? How can we adjust for the past and the future without just repeating platitudes? I've literally had this conversation over and over and over again, and there are a few podcasts that actually are trying to build things to help with this. For example, Nicholas Villarreal has tried to create a database system, a network that allows people to do worker inquiry and statistics based off work more organically without totally relying on the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the Federal Reserve Bank for the United States. So it's not to say that projects have not emerged out of this. There's also a project that Sean of Antifada is working on that also similarly wants to engage in workers' inquiry. There are often very tactical things led by podcast-owned local initiatives and whatnot. However, I will point out that I find that to be particularly an ineffective use of podcasts, except on an educational level, because podcast listeners tend to be too diffuse for them to be, and too national or international for them to be as useful as a regionally concentrated radio show may be. In some cases, our habits are defined, but also deformed, as I misspoke earlier, in the way in which prior media forms actually operated, even though ours really is only analogous to that. I remember once being approached when I worked for Doug Lane to run some ads on Kasama Swat, or to have some people, not ads, to run some interviews with staffers for Kasama Swat for her campaign in Seattle. And both sides eventually agreeing that it was a waste of time because, except for maybe getting some fundraising done at the national level, that I didn't have enough individual listeners in Seattle to make it worthwhile, even if I had enough globally. And this is something to think about why the left media has not led to the kinds of things that people want it to do. And in lieu of that, it often does turn the grifts. Sometimes unthinkingly, sometimes not intentionally. And when it doesn't, it often becomes a more diverse but limited show, which can frustrate people as well, because political solutions are not given offhand willy-nilly. And they shouldn't be, because these things are contextual, and often the podcasters don't know your regional or local or national context. Think about what this is for, because if people try to sell you stuff as politics it isn't, it will rot out your politics. It won't be helpful. Nor do people need to constantly be shifting between the idea that they must operate either solely on national level politics, in which they do not have as much control, or on local level politics, in which they are subjected to national and regional level politics. There needs to be coordination across these things, and there are binaries spoken about in media that are unhelpful in this regard. But that is because it does meet certain media needs, and most people are performing for what they think are good reasons within the context of the media, and that in and of itself is a problem. It creates path dependencies and bound choices. And with that, I want you to think on, what can you ask of media figures in your life that might help to get around this, so that they're not merely commenting on the next reactionary thing, because that actually helps the reactionaries out. They're not merely popping up strategic wins for the Democrats, because that doesn't really help drive their politics as a counterforce to standard Democratic politics, even if they talk about how bad the Democrats are. And you can go on and on and on with this. I'm just trying to educate you. That's really my only goal. You need to decide what you do with it. I put the onus and responsibility of enacting your politics on you. My responsibility is to give you good information that does not skew you or give you bad strategic incentives while I do so. So it's not that I have no responsibility here. I absolutely do. It's just not that kind of responsibility. And I don't confuse this with my personal politics. When I do politics, I'm doing it within a union. I'm doing it within local things here in Utah, or very specific national things where I have specific agendas and goals. That's not the theory end of the left, or the history end of the left, or the logic end of the left that I'm working on. I don't confuse that with immediate political goals. And a lot of people I know do, and offer that to you as a politics, even though it's not politically useful. All right. So I'd like to thank the following Khan Ilkahanen supporters. That is Martin T, Shane, and Kenneth K. I have been slowing down production here at Varn Blogland because I got a lot of complaints that I was overproducing. The algorithm was being more favorable to me, but I'll be honest with you, my growth is really in the podcast, not so much the YouTube, and in the Patreon engagement. My Patreons, about 60% think I'm producing a right amount, about 40% think that I'm overproducing, and if 40% of my patrons think I'm overproducing, then you guys who are not Varn super fans probably definitely do. So we are dying back. Plus, I need to do my day job. I want to write more books. I want to write articles. I have other projects down the line that I'm working on, including this larger project that I plan to do with Gene Badgelon at the beginning, I think, of next year on the national question and its history, which will be part of a Nailing It Down series. The goal in the future, by the end of October, is to be producing one solo and one interview a week, plus the 2 or 3 additional shows I do with other people a month, such as Parallax Vlog with JG Michaels, Notable Road with Jason and Chris of Regrettable Century, Game and Materialist with Gene over at co-production of TIR, and including I will be doing more stuff at TIR. I also, since this is coming out early enough for people to know, will be a guest at Give Them a Revolution event in LA. I will put the ticket ordering link in the show notes here, and you can come out and watch me and Daniel Besner and Kuba Resnitsky. I always mess up Kuba's name. At a panel and a larger show with This Is Revolution, Give Them an Argument, and Left Reckoning. David Griscom will be there. Matt Lech will be there. Anna Kasparin will be there. Nando. I just know Nando by Nando. Nando will be there. Nando, I hope you don't get mad that I know your last name. And then, of course, Jason Miles will be there. Ben Burgess will be there. Yeah. And so there are a lot of people who are going to be there. And I will be on the panel. I believe on the panel with Matt, Daniel Besner, and Kuba on international politics. And it is hosted by This Is Revolution, of which I and Varn Blog is the sometimes Y of their larger conglomerate. It's, they're your vowels and the sometimes Y, and I am the sometimes Y. So, and so I hope you come out and see me if you're in the greater LA area. We'd love to have you. Tickets are, I think, fairly reasonable for the event. So $25 in advance, $30 at the door. And it'll be an all-night affair. And then there's a meet and greet, which is more expensive. It begins at 5, and you can meet us all. I will also be in town in San Diego the day before. So if you know me and want to hang out, I have to hang out with some friends, and plus I have to get ready for the show, but I would love to because that is my birthday. And I turned 42, the meaning of life, whatever this year. So I hope you all come out if you are available. So thanks to my Kanye Klahanens. So those you don't know, I forgot Diving Into Wreckage. That's the most important show I do co-produced. There's 4 co-produced shows, guys. You get 3 of them on the patrons feed. I also try to do 1 Q&A a month for patrons based on a topic by my $10 sponsors, or if they want, they can do a co-interview with me where I interview them about something they really care about. I have a bunch of shows coming up. A lot of them are pre-programmed. I'm pre-programmed now until October. For those of you who haven't realized that, I do the premiere so people can still talk, and I sometimes pop into the premiere, but I don't like to live stream because I find them distracting. Sorry. I do give live streams to patrons, though. Again, that's what the live Q&A is for, and I try to do them once a month. There will be 2 in September because I didn't get one done in August. So the goal for the show eventually is 1 interview a week, 1 solo video a week, short one, between 15 minutes to an hour. And the audio for the short shows that are me only, that also goes to patrons. The audio for most, but not all, of the interviews becomes available to the public on the Varn Buzzsprout Public podcast, which is totally free. It does have ads, but it's totally free otherwise. And that's the interviews on this show that's slightly edited, cleaned up, and released to the public about a month later. And those are my projects. So follow along. And again, hope to see you at the show in LA. Have a great day.